10:15 p.m. here on the East Coast, 12:15 on the West Coast. Today is December 20th, 2016, 5 days till Christmas. I'm your host, Alex Hughes, and you are watching a brand new Sports Fusion News episode. On today's episode, we have a tremendous guest, Miss Stephania Bell. She is an ESPN injury analyst. So, Stephania, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Winding up the
I want to say welcome you on my show today, and I want to talk to you about, I know you have an injury or a fantasy sports podcast, right?
That is correct. It's called the Fantasy Focused Football Podcast, and I do it daily, Monday through Friday, with my co-hosts Field Yates and Matthew Berry.
Mm-hmm. So now what's that like working with those two football gurus, to say, and just really talking every day about football right now?
Well, we're pretty lucky that we get to call this our job, right? That every morning in our podcast, we try and provide the analysis. I obviously bring content, how you react to what's going on with players and their injuries for fantasy football purposes. But we also like to have a lot of fun with it. And Matthew is quite a comedian, so there's no shortage of nonsense on the show, as we call it. And Matthew and I have actually been doing it for 10 years now, and Field joined us a couple of years ago, so it's gotten to the point where sometimes we could finish each other's sentences.
Now talk to me a little about how you got into this career as an injury analyst, and how you really talk to ESPN about really bringing in this part of the fantasy sports part of really talking about injury statuses, because a lot of football fans for a while, they didn't really have a go-to podcast to say or person to talk like, what exact injury does my favorite player on my fantasy football team have? So how did that whole thing start?
It's interesting because, injuries are one of the toughest nuts to crack, really, when it comes to playing fantasy football. And I actually played fantasy football, and I'm a physical therapist. So the combination of the two is how when I was playing for myself a number of years ago, I realized I had a little bit of an edge in terms of understanding the injuries, and not just the injury, but how it would impact a football player at a particular position. So you didn't get much, and back then you really got nothing in the way of the injury reports other than a body part. And in my league, I noticed a lot of people were asking me questions about the injuries and trying to get tips and hints. And I thought, well, if my league mates want it, there's probably other people who want this information. And it took a while to sort of figure out how to go about it, but I ended up meeting some folks in the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, and eventually got hooked up with a couple of outfits to do a little bit of writing, and that exposure got me noticed by Matthew, and he was building the fantasy group at ESPN, and they had me come out for an audition, and basically that platform is what then allowed it to grow. Fantasy football was just getting off the ground. It had been going on for a few years at ESPN, but certainly not like you see it now, where it's blown up everywhere. I mean, we weren't on TV. The first year I came, it was a digital online show, which was something that hadn't been tried before. Wow. And the podcast started then. And then gradually it's grown. And now we have 2 shows a week on television and the daily podcast Monday through Friday. So fantasy football has really taken off. And the injury component of it is important enough that you see a lot of other networks doing it as well.
Yeah, that's great. And you not only cover football, you also cover a few other sports. And I noticed a few months ago, a top WWE superstar, Finn Balor, got injured, and you actually wrote an article about his injury. So what was that like, taking on a different sport, I guess WWE, I consider it a sport.
Yes,
so what was it like?
All sports. Really, I've done something with esports. We also launched a vertical in the area of esports. So I think the point is that injuries happen to everyone. And as a physical therapist, if somebody were to come in to see me as a patient, my job is to figure out not only what's wrong in terms of what the injury is and what's involved, but what is it that they need to get back to doing. And then the goal is to treat them and get them back to that activity. So as a PT, you learn a lot about what do they need to do. If I'm not familiar with the sport, I need to find out what is it they need to do. So when I'm here at ESPN, even if I learned about NASCAR when I got here. I didn't really know much about that. And we had Denny Hamlin tore his ACL, and they wanted me to talk about how it would impact him. And I really had to learn what did he need to do? And what I found was one of the hardest things was getting in and out of the car, because you have to go in feet first through the window. And so things like that you might not think of. So it's the same in the case of WWE. We've increased our coverage there. So these athletes are going to get hurt as well. And Finn actually had a significant shoulder injury. So to be able to help break it down for the fans, what he went through, what the surgery involves, what the rehab process is like, which is something that I'm familiar with as a PT. For me, I love covering the breadth of sports because it gives me an opportunity to do different things.
Yeah, that's great. And before we wrap up the interview, I want to ask you, I know you're on a fantasy football podcast like we talked about earlier in the show, if you are just joining us. And now, Stephania, this week, football is, there's only about 3 months left of the season. So with this week, who's going to be the surprising guys, wrapping up the season right before Christmas time? Do you have any secrets for us?
Well, I think at this point, it's championship week for most fantasy football leagues. So I don't think there's really many surprises. People are just hoping they can get their big guys who got them. If they're playing in the championship and a couple key players have been out, I think the player to watch this week is Julio Jones for the Atlanta Falcons wide receiver. He's been a rock star for a lot of fantasy football teams, and he's been out for a couple weeks with a toe injury, but it's certainly looking good for him to come back this week. So I think the fantasy owners who made it this far are going to be pleasantly surprised. Fingers crossed.
Yes. And one more question before we end this Sports Fusion episode. I'm a Patriots fan, and my guy Rob Gronkowski got
Your team's pretty good.
Weeks ago. So can you talk a little bit about Rob Gronkowski and what's his offseason going to be like to get back to the Patriots next season?
Well, there are a few things about Rob Gronkowski. He's had some pretty significant injuries, but his work ethic is amazing. And for the personality that he has, people might not realize that, but the stuff he's come back from might have been enough to keep other people from coming back, between his forearm, his knee injury. This is his third back surgery, so it's not insignificant. He's had 2 back surgeries in the past. So, it's a serious thing. It was clear that he was not going to make it back this season. I have every expectation he'll come back. And if you want to look at the positive side as a Patriots fan, he's been through this before. He knows the rehab. That makes it that much easier for him to just get right back to doing what he needs to do. And I believe he'll be ready to go when the season starts.
Awesome. Okay, Stephania, before we leave, where can fans find you on Twitter and on other social medias, and where can they listen to the podcast and watch the podcast every week?
Well, the podcast is on ESPN. You can go to the app, the ESPN app. You can hit the listen tab and you'll find the podcast there. It's the Fantasy Focused Football Podcast. It's also available on iTunes. My Twitter handle is Stephania_ESPN, and that's where I do most of my social media stuff. I am on Twitter at StephaniaB87. I mean, not Twitter, Instagram at StephaniaB87, and Stephania Bell on Facebook.
Awesome. Be sure to follow her on social media, and we'll be back here at 3:45 with another Sports Fusion News episode. Thanks for watching. I will see you later.